Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live webinar today. Thank you so much for joining us. You just joined She Can Code's engineers, programmers, and developers. What's the difference? I'm your host today, the content director at She Can Code. My name is Kaylee Bateman. For those tuning in who aren't familiar with us, She Can Code is a global community with a mission to close the tech gender gap. We use content, marketing, and events to engage, inspire, and attract more diverse communities to the tech sector. Now, before I introduce our speakers, please note that we have a live Q&A session running today, so please submit your questions throughout and we will try and get to them at the end. So let's kick off with my two wonderful guests for today. I have Darren Benson, VP of Engineering at Ripjar, and Jonathan Fenwick, Partner Technology and Engineering at Capco. Welcome both. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Kelly.
We'd love to kick off with a bit of background about both of you, just to set the scene for the discussion today. So, Darren, can we start with yourself? Can you share a little bit of background about yourself, please?
Sure, yeah, no problem. So I'm the VP of Engineering at Ripjar. So at Ripjar, we help government organisations automate the detection, investigation and monitoring of threats from criminal activity. So we do this using artificial intelligence and machine learning. So it's a very sort of engineering focused role. Obviously, well, the whole company is very engineering focused. I myself have been in sort of the software industry for 29 years now. So I started with having a degree in software engineering. This was one of the first in the UK in the early 90s. I then sort of worked in various roles from sort of software engineer through to architect, and then through the sort of the management track and into where I am now currently.
Amazing. And Jonathan, yourself?
Yep, sure. So I'm Jonathan Fenwick. I lead technology and engineering at Capco. We're a management consultancy that work within financial services, and we help our clients with engineering teams to help them deliver the solutions that they want. So my teams work in lots of different environments with lots of different names for the job roles that exist within those specific organizations. My background is I actually started as a developer in 1995, so 28 years ago. I was self-taught. I do not have a STEM degree, and I progressed my career through being a developer up until around 2012 when I was still hands-on. I still contribute to open source projects today, but I predominantly focus on leading large engineering teams and building large engineering teams.
And it's nice to hear that you both have different backgrounds as well. Darren, you came from a more traditional studying STEM degree, and Jonathan, you came from a different route. So that's going to be a good conversation today to hear your experience. So today's conversation actually was inspired by a blog that was on and still is on shecancode.io. It's a very popular blog, and we felt that we should have a discussion around it because it is something that people ask us often. So we're going to be talking about the difference between engineers, programmers, and developers. So, Darren, can we kick off with the question that's on everybody's lips for this webinar? Can you tell us what is the difference between an engineer, a programmer, and a developer?
Well, I guess to start with, I mean, they're all similar in the sense that this is all about someone who creates software. The difference really is the scope of that creation of software. So a programmer, for example, would just be mainly focused on the implementing the functionality, which is often designed and specified by somebody else. Although in the old days they were analyst programmers, but that's not part of this webinar, I guess. But they don't usually get involved in the wider sort of system design or architecture, sometimes not even sort of testing or deployment. So it's a very sort of focused role, really. Software developers is more of a wider responsibility, wider scope in what they do. So obviously they still write code, but they'll also be involved in the sort of designing, building, testing, and even sort of deploying of that. But their focus is more on the sort of immediate delivery of requirements. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes the sort of expense of wider sort of systems architecture, possibly even maintainability. So this is something sort of from my experience, often seen a startup, which is about let's get this done, let's get it done quickly, let's get these new features out. So software engineer, it's the sort of widest responsibility, sort of in terms of, I guess, both time and scale. So although a lot of the time software engineers also spent in programming, they also have to sort of consider that their code has to be maintained over time. They also need to consider sort of accuracy, performance, and maintainability of the code that they're producing. So analogy that I sort of often use when I'm sort of explaining this to people, it's if you ask a developer to make you a bridge over a ravine, They'll sort of chop a tree down. They'll say, well, there's your bridge. If you say the bridge isn't strong enough, or you need to get sort of bigger vehicles over, they'll chop more trees down until you've got enough trees to get you over there. If you ask an engineer, then they're going to say, well, what type of bridge do you like? What materials have we got? What other bridges have been used to carry this type of vehicles over there, for example? What materials have we got available? A programmer is going to do whatever the engineer or developer asks, probably chop a tree down or what it is. So that's how I would sort of define the difference between the roles.
Yes, I love that. Your example is absolutely perfect, because I suppose it's a different in personality as well, isn't it? It's not just a difference in job, it's what you prefer to do, whether or not you think for the short term and you do things fast and you do small projects fast, or you think for the long term, as you explained, that's more of the engineer side. Jonathan, would you agree? Is that kind of been your experience of the difference between the three?
Absolutely. I think the key point that Darren mentioned there was around the overlap of some of these roles. I think both skills wise and actually very importantly behavior wise, right? The core fundamentals of the sort of behaviors and the mindset are very similar amongst these roles, and it is really the scope of what somebody does, on a day-to-day basis, which is the difference and the variation between those. All of those roles are critical to build, good software to meet end user requirements and to deliver the sorts of features that you want to those end users. But they do have those slightly different focuses and all important in the overall solution that gets taken to market.
Yeah. And so, Jonathan, is that why you think then there's been such confusion around the roles? And is that something that's gradually happened over time, or is that a new thing?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting question because my perspective on this is that historically, there perhaps wasn't this really defined definition of these different scope of roles. I think, and I'm talking at the start of my career, when software development and delivery was really a bit more in its infancy around how that happened. And with the internet coming into play, there's an explosion of software creation. And what that really meant is that teams scaled up, teams got bigger, solutions became more complex to meet ever evolving sort of end user needs and services that could be delivered via software. And I think specialism of this, or at least the definition of this, has crept in over time because we've learned more about the process of software delivery in of itself. And roles and specialisms and the importance of collaboration have come to the fore in terms of successfully delivering. Because software products are more complex now, right? They are at bigger scale. They are, leveraging lots of different components that can be composed together to build software. So I think it's happened over time. Interestingly, I think the definition that Darren's talked about, I think, is pretty set now. I think some confusion comes in, though, still, because different companies and therefore, by definition, different leaders and managers in different companies still have their own preferences and opinions around how they want to set up teams to be successful within their context. And that does lead to some confusion if you look at two different job specs and they've got the same title, but the roles and responsibilities that are listed can be slightly different. But I'll still come back to this core point. I think behaviors overlap a lot. If you were to draw a diagram around curiosity and continuous learning and collaboration and working within a team environment, remain the same across many of these things. And technical skills, there's obviously a big overlap around that as well, even if some of the sort of frameworks and technologies are a little bit different. So I think people can move between these aspects, and in fact some people may start as developers focused on features and then over their career perhaps start to lean towards more sustainable elements that Darren was talking about holistic design of the system, getting more involved in architecture. And that's a natural progression in individuals' sort of career, dependent on what people want to do and what they enjoy.
Yes, you just mentioned some of the behavioural differences there. I suppose, is that still true? Then you mentioned they're working across teams, but traditionally you would think software engineer is somebody that works with a team, they might talk to clients, work with clients, they might even write an internal manual that helps everybody on the team. A developer would be more siloed. Is that not the case anymore?
No, I think that's true, and it goes back again to the analogy that Darren laid out. The scope is a bit smaller, so a developer is going to be focusing on this specific feature, this thing that we want to develop to roll out to a client, and therefore it's a potentially smaller piece of work that can be handled by one, maybe two people and developed together. And so the collaboration circle, just like the scope of the role, is perhaps a little bit smaller. Whereas a software engineer that's having to look across, holistically across a different system, perhaps having to work with different developer squads, pods, whatever the terminology of that particular organization is. And therefore they will have to collaborate a little bit more and think about the long-term sustainability, needs perhaps a little bit more consensus, collaboration, discussion to get to that. So I think you're right. I think that certainly still exists, but collaboration is still key in both roles. In my
all roles, yeah. I suppose a developer, if you want to get something done fast and see results, developer. I have read before as well that developers, they will disappear and go off and write a load of code and then come out and find that it needs lots of changes, and that they've kind of come out from nowhere, and then they see their team and then changes need to be made. Whereas with an engineer, they tend to collaborate more with the wider team. Again, I suppose it comes back to how you prefer to work as a person, and obviously what makes you happy in your day-to-day. Darren, is that something you've seen over time, that confusion between the roles has that got better, do you think, over time, in your own opinion?
I think exactly as Jonathan said, it depends a lot on the managers themselves, really, and how they perceive it, potentially their background that they've come from. I often find a better way of judging what the role is more about where is the company, what sort of sector is that company in, what's the requirements of that particular area. So, for example, if it's a medical or a science company, they've got a high dependency on accuracy, so obviously designing and planning is very important to them. If it's a finance e-commerce, then obviously maybe it's sort of volume, it's more performance. The architecture could be more important in what they're doing. Those sorts of companies, you have to have engineering, whether they call it developer or programmer, whatever. Ultimately, engineering is core to what they do. I always say that if you're not measuring, you're not engineering. So, if you think about, if you're a civil engineer or an aviation engineer, they're going to measure things. If you're not measuring something in the job you're doing, then you're not engineering. That's always been my view of that. And yes. I think you need to look at accuracy or performance. You have to measure that. If you're measuring it, then you're engineering. That's my view. Other sectors, if it's primarily advertising or marketing, going back to the old sort of web developer days, I guess, things need to be done quickly. It might be throwaway, the work you're doing. So the architecture doesn't really matter so much. The longevity of the code doesn't matter too much. Maintainability, not as important. So developers are more likely to be in that space. I think a programmer sort of technically can be in any of those areas. If that's the sort of focus of the company, they can use programmers in that way. I think that's less common, though, certainly from my experience. You're generally going to be a developer or an engineer. But I think another key thing really is the maturity of the business as well. I've worked for a lot of startup businesses, and generally they want to get things done quickly. So they'll hire what they'll call a lot of engineers, but they'll really be more developers. They want to get things done as quickly as possible. They need to focus on chasing a market or a user base. Let's get things out. Let's see if that works, and then we'll worry about the tech debt costs later on, and we'll try and sort of build that in. But I think rather than the job title itself, look at what the job involves. Look at the sector that the company's in. Look at the role itself. Does it involve? Is accuracy and performance important to them? If you're in an interview, ask them the question, what do you measure? Ask them some of those metrics, if they know what they are. And if they do, then they're probably going to be engineering.
Yes, definitely. And in terms of before you get to that interview, obviously you require different qualifications and skills before you get there. Jonathan, are there different qualifications and skills needed for each of those roles? I'm assuming if you're a software engineer, you would need to know a lot more languages, a lot more things, whereas a developer and a programmer, you might think, do they just work in one language? How does that work?
Yeah, I would hesitate to sort of lock it down to specific sort of academic qualifications, because I'd be a bit of a hypocrite in many ways. But I think it's certainly true that if you are going to operate in an engineering role, you potentially are a bit more likely to have come from a STEM background or gained that experience through real world experience. And there are certain things that because you're focused a little bit more on non-functional aspects of a system, because you're interested in sustainability of that delivery and the accuracy of that delivery, you potentially are going to come learn more around algorithms, patterns, other things that are core to sort of software design. I think but I wouldn't want to box people into that either, because it really is about what do people enjoy doing. I've worked with people that have come from if you like, that classical sort of educational background, that love delivering features to end users, right? And therefore, have leaned towards being developers, front end developers, where they're excited by delivering features to end users and seeing them in the real world. And I think that's really important. I think that you can learn and transition both ways. I think, but there are some differereations around what you may focus any learning time you get, or how you what experience you look to develop through real world. But I wouldn't like to box it in and say you must have these qualifications or these skills. I mean, on the technical skill side of things, I think that yes, the frameworks and the technologies themselves could differ. So just as a concrete example, if someone was going to work closer to the infrastructure, then they might be looking to use Go and similar frameworks. If obviously they were looking to be a developer focusing on feature development, then JavaScript and React and those sorts of frameworks are obviously going to be the ones to focus on valuable development time on. So I wouldn't like to box people in. I think people should think about what they enjoy doing. I certainly started as more of a developer and moved more towards an engineer over time, because I found that I really enjoyed personally thinking about the bigger picture, thinking about the architecture, thinking about how to make systems more extensible over time and performant. And I think, again, just to validate some of the stuff that Darren said, in Capco, we work with financial services, and stability, performance, security, all of these things are obviously absolutely critical to providing financial service solutions.
So did you start, because you came from a non-technical background, were you one of those people that kind of wrote your own scripts to kind of help automate your daily tasks, but then it went from one to another, and as you said, you can transition then into engineering?
I think we could do a whole webinar on the story of how I got into technology, but just to say, I learned from books and stayed up very late at night to teach myself development. But there's a whole other story attached to that, which I won't go into because we've got limited time. But it was through laziness. I learned to automate things that I was doing in my day-to-day job at the time, and that then ultimately translated to the career that I've had for a long time.
Yeah. And did you take boot camps or anything like that? We always get asked about boot camps on our webinars and whether or not they're right for people, or even if they're worth it. What should they take? Did you take that route?
So I personally didn't, partly because boot camps didn't really exist. I'm going to feel very old. But what I will say is, within the hiring that I do, that the team does, we take people both from more traditional sort of educational background, but also people that have come from boot camps. And I find that their experience is beneficial in different ways. And generally their sort of development path is different, but ultimately both can be successful, right, with the right approach to their own learning, to feedback, to collaboration, to all these different things. So yeah, I hire both.
Yeah, and Darren, you came from more of a university-based background. Nowadays, when you're looking to hire new staff, what kind of qualifications do you look for? What matters to each of these roles, do you think?
I think the problem with qualifications, I mean, they soon go out of date. I think if you're in this industry, you have to be learning all the time, and you have to go in with that mindset that I've got to learn something new continually. You're not just going to hit a certain level and then never need to learn anything new again. So I think for me, the key thing in any of these sort of roles, whether you're a sort of programmer, developer, or engineer, is, are you a good problem solver? How do you solve a problem? Because that's what we're really there to do. And it's really, I look for people that have got a good take on that problem solving ability. And I think ultimately, if you've got a good problem solving ability, you'll work out yourself how to actually learn enough to do what you need to do just from that, just from that your own way of working, because you're a good problem solver.
Yeah. And do you think though companies and employers, do they do enough to make a clear distinction between the roles, or do you still find people are still quite confused? I suppose it depends who the role comes from as well internally, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, for me, engineering is certainly more process-based, really. So I think if you're someone who likes working to a defined process, you like to own the whole problem from inception through to deployment and maintenance, and also over time as well, then engineering is the area that most suits you. And I'm sure that like I say again, if you're a good problem solver, you'll learn the skills you need as you go to get there. That's part of the role itself. I think if you prefer a more sort of loose process, sort of quick fire, sort of moving on to the next thing, what's the next thing of interest, then that's more, in my mind, more of the developer. You again, you're still learning, you're learning different skills. It's not about how many languages you learn, it's about how you learn enough to do the job that you need to do. I think if you just enjoy writing code, then then ultimately that's probably down the programmer route. Well, I do think obviously with the whole sort of uptake on ChatGPT and sort of Copilot and everything, that just writing code in itself is something that is going to be more at risk there. I think again it's that problem solving ability that humans have that an AI doesn't have, that it's really going to drive this forward.
Yes, definitely. And I suppose with the difference between the three, we've mentioned about the difference in personalities between the three massively, because you might get an interview and then realise that one's not for you. Jonathan, have you noticed that sometimes that people might get in and think, actually, this wasn't for me? Are companies doing enough to make a clear distinction between the three?
I think we've already touched on this. I think different companies have a slightly different context, slightly different setup, and that's what probably can be at the root of some of the confusion around this. But I think there are some questions that you can ask during the interview process, right? To really try and understand the scope of the role that you'll be doing. So again, if we extrapolate some of the things that have been said already, who will I interact with on a day-to-day basis is a really good question, because we've talked about the different, perhaps in scope of the scope of the work that you may be doing. How involved would I be if you're looking for an engineering role, how involved would I be in architectural decisions or architectural evolution of the solution that I'm working on? Another interesting question to ask is around, where does the stories, the requirements that I'm going to work from originate from? Are they originated, around user stories, user journeys, user experience, or are they more generated from platform non-functional requirements, that type of thing? And I think with some good questions, which, to be honest, personally, I believe that good questions from candidates differentiates between good and great candidates. At the end of an interview, you can sort of kill two birds with one stone here. You can ask some really good questions, and you can make sure this role is actually what you believe it to be, and validate that, and explore that. And I think that's good from an interviewer perspective to hear those types of thinking and questions.
Yes, definitely, because you want the right person in that role.
Yes.
As well. There's nothing worse than getting the wrong person on your team and they didn't quite understand what it was going to be about, obviously. have heard that the differences between all of the roles, obviously, as we've spoken about, are very much personality styles as well. Is it true that software engineers are the kind of people that write code, that check their own code, whereas developers just, it's incredibly fast?
I think they're more likely. Again, I don't want to pigeonhole anyone. I've seen software developers that take great pride in terms of their own testing and their own quality, and I think that's a good behaviour in general for sure. But certainly, I think going back to the point that was made around software engineers, focusing about process and accuracy and quality, right? I think that natural inclination for those types of roles, for those types of people that take those roles, to really focus on that, because that's sort of one of the key, if you like, success criteria for them in terms of how they're contributing to the team's effort.
Yes. And Darren, yourself, what type of questions do you think people should ask in the interview to, basically to ensure that you're actually going for a job that you want, and it's not one dressed up as another one, and then you get a surprise when you get in there?
I think, a lot of it, as we said, engineering is about processes. So if you ask them, what is the process of, what process do you work to? How do you get software out the door? So me as an individual, I'm writing some code. Where do my requirements come from? Where do they, where does the code I write go to? And if it's, you can work out, if they've got a full process around this, then, you're going to know it's more of an engineering type role. If it's more about just, we go through requirements as quickly as possible, you can work more fluidly, then that's going to be more of a development type role. I think for me, if you're more of a strategic thinker, you are thinking for the long term, then engineering is more of the role that's probably more suitable. If you're more of a tactical, let's get something done, quick fire, then that's more of the development route. And you can tell, if you ask those sort of questions around how does, what's my day to day, what would a typical day in the life be like for me there, you can hopefully work that out from how they'd expect you to work there.
Yes, and from some of both of your answers so far, it sounds like as you said, the engineer is more for the long term, the developer for the short term. I'm curious now to know, does that have a bearing on salaries though? Does that mean that software engineers technically demand a higher salary? Or again, is that, Jonathan, something, you can't pigeonhole it, it depends on the person and the company?
I think, again, it depends a little bit on the context, but certainly companies do value people that are thinking about the long-term sustainability, dependent on their maturity, dependent on some of the things that have already been said here, which is because good software engineering will actually enable more developers to be developing on the platform, to be able to getting features out, to be getting those features out more quickly and safely, etc. And ultimately that creates value, in terms of end users, customers, etc. I think that they are critical roles, and the goal actually is to have probably a sustainable number of fewer, and this is maybe a contentious, software engineers, but more software developers focusing on those features, focusing on getting value out of the door. But you can only do that on a platform that is stable, on a solution that is stable, because you've got good engineering practices in place, good standards in place, good patterns in place, confidence in sort of non-functional performance, etc. So I'm not sure I've answered the questions on salaries specifically, because customer experience is equally hyper important, right? Delivering excellent customer experience where your software touches the user, in certain businesses, in certain products, or in a lot of products, that can be a key differentiator, right? Dependent on the industry. And I think, so I don't want to sort of undervalue that either, right? But I think both things are important. I'll go back to what I said earlier, to have to be delivering quality, successful software products, you have to have all these skills in combination. Different companies may judge the value of those differently. I personally don't. I don't actually, in Capco, we don't actually have a difference between those salaries. But yeah, other organisations may.
Yes, Darren, yourself, because I was sitting there thinking, as a listener, I'd be thinking, well, which one demands the highest salary then?
Well, I think it's also important to look within the organisation itself. What's the actual career path look like within the organisation itself? You know, we're talking about the different roles here, but there's also the seniority of those roles as well. You know, you can be a senior software engineer, you can be a staff engineer, you can be a principal engineer. There's different levels within the organisation itself, and some companies don't have that. Some are a bit more about, you know, certainly if you're a startup, it's maybe more of a flat structure. It may be more about, you know, what do you know, rather than, you know, the breadth of your knowledge, the depth of your knowledge sometimes. I think it's important to plan your career as you go forward. So the organisation you're in, if you're in a startup, you can grow with the organisation. If you're in a larger organisation, well, what does their career path look like, and how do you move between the levels there? And that's also a good question to ask, I think, during the interview. You know, how could I see myself progressing here? What does it mean to be a senior engineer here versus a standard engineer, for example?
Yes, great question to ask in an interview. Obviously, if you're in it for the long run. If you're transitioning into tech for the first time, though, the three roles can look very similar. Darren, how do you think newcomers kind of familiarise themselves with the differences in the roles? I suppose if you've never tried one, how are you going to know the difference?
Well, I mean, the best way is just to try. And like I said, I think if you're a good problem solver, you'll work it out. You know, if you could go into any role that you're given and you'll work a way forward, whether that's, you know, learning yourself at home, reading, whatever it is, you'll find a way. And if you're that type of person, then I wouldn't read too much about the role itself. You know, it's more about, is the company or the industry of interest to you? You know, that's going to drive you more, I think. If you're somebody who likes to be guided more, then, you know, it's better to perhaps, again, look at what processes are there. I think for me, you know, if it's a very sort of fluid organization and you're going in, you know, and you're expected to pick things up as you go, it can be more difficult sometimes. So, you know, if that's not the type of way you like to learn, then I would suggest more of an engineering type role would be more suitable, where there is a more of a defined process that you can learn that process to help you. And you know, I think as Jonathan said earlier, you know, you can transition between these. You know, you can be an engineer and you can become a developer if you want to. And you know, it's a different, because it's the scope that changes. You know, you can take different elements from different roles into different ones as well.
Yes, I love the fact that you said always making sure that you focus on the company and the industry that you pick as well. It isn't just the job itself. It's about whether or not you feel like you're making an impact, which is something, it's one of those well-hidden secrets in tech that people don't realize. You know, you're not just there to write code all day and that's it. And you know, you actually make an impact depending on the company that you work at. So yeah, really important element to look for when you're moving into tech. Jonathan, and as Darren said, you mentioned about, you know, you can just go into one role and transition quite easily into others. Is that, I suppose, a good starting point?
Yeah, perhaps not easily.
I
think you can by working with your manager, your peers, right? And what's the development plan? How do you start to get involved in some other aspects? So for instance, if you're start as a developer and then you'd like to move more towards the engineering side, how do you do that, right? Like, what's the sorts of things you can start to become involved in? What's the development plan? What is the gap that you may have? So I think being sort of actively planning on that transition is important. I'm saying that with the right behaviors, attitude, mindset, you can definitely make that move, right? And I think yes, I think there's no real barriers to that. And you are building on knowledge and experience that you have, right? I mean, and that is an important point. I'll go back to this concept of Venn diagrams. If you map these roles out in a Venn diagram, they do have significant overlap. They are different, but they do have, it's not like, you know, they're completely detached circles and you've got to learn everything from scratch. I do think, and just to touch on maybe a sort of tangential item, I think having some level of confidence within a narrower scope sometimes is a help, right? Imposter syndrome, right, which is obviously, well, it's prevalent in tech, right? I have chronic imposter syndrome, which is, some people are surprised at, but I think that having some confidence in a smaller scope sometimes is a really great way to get started, right? And then you can, as you get settled into a company, you understand a bit more about the career development opportunities on a day-to-day basis. Once you're a bit more confident, you've delivered, you feel like you've had some impact, then that's a great time to start to think about, okay, what would I like to do next? How am I going to get there? What help do I need to get there? What coaching, mentoring do I need to get there?
Yes, we actually had a whole webinar on imposter syndrome, because you are not the only one. There are a lot of us in tech that have exactly that feeling. And I just saw actually somebody dropped in the chat about the difference in qualities between the three roles, and somebody asked, would it be easy to transition between the roles? Which you just answered their question there. Darren, we're coming to the end, but I wanted to ask you, what advice would you give our listeners on how to figure out what role is best for them? Because it's not just down to qualifications, is it? It's down to personality types, the way you like to work, the company you'd want to work for. How would our listeners figure that out?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this, I think, is down to asking those questions in an interview. A lot of them, I mean, generally in a sort of job description or an actual advert, they're going to be sort of saying these are the skills we're looking for. They might give you a bit of an insight into what the role is, but I think ask those sorts of questions. How would I work with my peers? What would my team be like? How do I work with product, for example? How do I work with the customer? All these sorts of questions, and see if that's somewhere that you'd like to work. See if that's somewhere that's appeals to you. Again, if you're in, I think if you're in an industry that you like, it's something that you're maybe aware of, not just from a technical viewpoint, maybe from the external side of that business as well. It's going to drive you more into what you do. So ask them some questions around that. Ask questions around what training's provided, how do they onboard people, all these things, just to give you a feeling about how ultimately they're going to help you grow as an engineer or developer within that organization. It's not just about writing code, it's about sort of feeling part of that community within the organization that that ultimately helps everybody. I think if you're in a team with a good group of problem solvers that can all work together, you can solve or do anything. You do, and I think that helps with that imposter syndrome type thing. If you're in a good team, everyone's going to come to your aid, you can go and help them, and that gives you confidence as well in what you're doing. So I do think sometimes it's seen that all the sort of people in this sort of industry just sort of sitting alone in the bedroom or in the office typing away, but it is very much a community type way of working. And I think if you're that type of person, if you can ask the right questions, then you're going to get the right answers.
Yes, and great advice on the questions to ask within the interview. I think when it's your first job as well, you're not always that confident about asking the right questions. You're just thinking, oh God, I need this job. You might ask some very basic, obvious questions, but yeah, it's great to really get into the specifics of what your job would actually entail.
Sorry, just to interject on that point, right? Doing some really good research on the company, going on asking some really good questions. Paradoxically, you're more likely to get that role, even if there's some gaps in the technical aspects, right? When you're more junior, obviously there's a bar that has to be met, but I think that really makes a difference to ask some really good questions based on research you've done on a company. I often find as well that you can sometimes reach out to people on LinkedIn nowadays that work there and ask them, and you'll get a good sense if people get back to you around, oh yeah, I'm happy to tell you, spend 15 minutes doing an intro, tell you a bit about that company, right? I think that's a good indicator of the sort of culture and what it may be like if you're successful.
Yes, and actually, because I just saw a question that said, I'm thinking about transitioning into engineering, but I don't have a STEM degree. So do you have any advice on getting seen or even getting experience? But actually, that's great advice, just to reach out to somebody on LinkedIn. If you don't have the experience, maybe even just, trying to build your network is a great way to get started. But if you don't have a STEM degree, how do you get seen without the experience? Do either of you have any advice there?
I think that really depends on the organisation themselves. Some people will have a bar that is dependent upon that. Not always, but that's often the case, which is a shame, I think, because as I say, it's about how you learn the new things. It's more important about the things that you've learned already, because there's always going to be something new to learn there. I think ultimately it is about reaching out. It's finding out, to people already working there, ask them a question, how did you get in here? Or, but also I think consider, is that somewhere that you want to work as well? Because, if they're, it may not necessarily suit your personality that you want to work in that sort of area as well. It's not the be all and end all. I wouldn't say that just getting a qualification to get a particular software engineering role at a particular company, it's not all software engineering roles. It's just that particular company that there's other ways in. There's other companies that won't have that barrier, for example. And ultimately, certainly from my experience, I don't think it matters too much. It is more about what you can do rather than what you've learned years ago potentially.
Yes, and I can see somebody in here, and you talking about other routes in. Somebody's put in a question. I'm 17 and weighing up a STEM degree or an apprenticeship. Do you think more and more companies are looking past degrees? Is that something that you've both experienced?
I would say that certainly, in the job market as it stands now, people are just looking for good people. And if you can sort of show that you can add value there, then that's more important than anything else. It is, I think, sometimes the degree gets you the interview, but it's the interview itself that gets you the job. So again, it's not the be all and end all, I would say. I mean, from me, my experience, I actually, before I did my degree, I did a BTEC in computer studies, and I found that was very hands-on. We were actually sort of writing code out. We went to sort of into industry and wrote some actual programs, for other companies. And for me, I learned more from that than I learned from my degree itself. The degree was very much about the processes and principles, but the actual computer studies sort of BTEC that I did at the time, that actually taught me to really work in the industry. So for me, I think hands-on is always going to be the experience. But but obviously it depends on the role itself. But you do need to know some of the processes and principles that go around it as well. That's what the degree is going to give you.
Yes, definitely. I can see somebody else in here. They're a beginner learning to code, and they're interested in development roles. They have asked about different boot camps, training programs. Does any that use would advise anybody, going towards that direction. We do have a selection of courses and boot camps as well on shecancode.io. So if anybody wants to head over there and have a little look as to what boot camps are available and would be good if you're beginning to learn to code. Are there anything, Jonathan, you said you didn't take a boot camp, but are there any learnings that either of you would recommend that you still use now in your own time?
I think Darren touched on a very important point, which is practical experience, right? So, and this, I don't think this matters whether you come from traditional or through a boot camp, and I'll come back specifically to boot camps in a minute. I think being able to talk about a solution that you've worked on, because you've worked on that hands-on, what did you learn? What did you try? What didn't work? Why did you approach it the way that you did? What was the problem you were trying to solve? I think even if that's small examples, if you're at the start of your career, that can be, really impressive to an interviewer. I would caution, whether it's traditional or whether it's just boot camp, relying on the experiences that you had in those things. So what I mean by that is, if I was interviewing someone that's is a graduate coming from a university, and the only things that they can explain are their group projects on the university, that's useful, but I would say it's not quite enough to show that because it was a requirement of the course, right? It was not something that they've looked into themselves, come up with themselves, collaborated with others outside of that. And the same is true of boot camp. If it's boot camp projects, they're obviously great learning experience, but I would personally look for some other practical experience outside of that, or some other interest outside of that shows that this person really, has got that learning mindset that has worked on some things. And so looping back slightly to the apprentice question, it depends, because there are some people that have got into the practicalities of that even, before they get to the decision point around university or apprenticeship. And to me, sometimes the apprenticeship is a better route if they've already got some foundational practical experience, however small, you know, open source or small open source, or they've got a GitHub repository they've worked on themselves, right? I think I think practical experience is super important, and I think you can get that in different ways, in different routes.
Yes, because I can see someone in here asking, does the likes of LinkedIn and GitHub benefit much when applying for jobs, and just, you know, just showing your enthusiasm outside of an interview? So
I appreciate we're close to it. This is a genuine story. I had someone contact me on LinkedIn who had just started a boot camp. She'd worked in fashion for 9 years. She'd didn't have any educational background. She contacted me directly. We had a chat. She talked to me about other things she was doing. She was starting to go to meetups to learn a bit wider stuff. She'd started to work on some of her own personal projects. She got hired, and she got promoted within a year. And, you know, that's an example of someone that, you know, took the initiative, go beyond, you know, I don't want to say just doing a boot camp, because I know they're hard work as well, but really was demonstrated she was committed to learning, was learning, wanted to move into tech, and you know, she's been super successful since doing that, and she's only at the start of her career, because I expect her to carry on that trajectory.
Yeah, incredible. And Darren, is that something when you're hiring, for instance, do you look for people that have gone above and beyond? You know, not
absolutely. I mean, I think a boot camp it's a happy path. Usually, it'll give you all the answers along the way. I think, you know, a key thing within any of these roles really is, if you don't know the answer, how do you find it? And I think that's really where you go beyond the boot camp. You know, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to take the knowledge that I've got from that, I'm going to try something else. And there'll be things there that you don't know that you have to learn, and it's that learning that helps. One question I always ask in an interview is sort of, you know, what's the biggest technical mistake you've made on any piece of work you've been working on? And I think, you know, you can learn a lot from somebody by the mistakes that they've made, rather than just, you know, if they have no problems at all, then, you know, maybe they've not learned as much as somebody else. But I think, you know, you learn from your mistakes and you build on those and you keep going forward from that.
Yes. We are already out of time, and we could continue talking about this all afternoon, but I'm going to have to stop it there. So Jonathan and Darren, thank you so much for the discussion today and joining us. It has been a pleasure having you both on the webinar. So thank you so much.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
And to everybody listening, as always, thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you on the next webinar. Please go over to shecancode.io to sign up to our community, see all of our wonderful content, find out about new training courses and boot camps over there and which one works for you. And you will be able to see this recording again from tomorrow on the website as well. So in the meantime, thank you all so much for joining, and we hope to see you again next time. Thank you all. Bye.